In 1996, Joshua M. Epstein and Robert Axtell published a book called Growing Artificial Societies. This is the introduction from that book. Introduction. Herbert Simon is fond of arguing that the social sciences are, in fact, the hard sciences. For one, many crucially important social processes are complex. They are not neatly decomposable into separate sub-processes, economic, demographic, cultural, spatial, whose isolated analyses can be aggregated to give an adequate analysis of the social process as a whole. And yet, this is exactly how social science is organised, into more or less insular departments and journals of economics, demography, political science, and so forth. Of course, most social scientists would readily agree that these divisions are artificial, but they would argue there is no natural methodology for studying these processes together as they co-evolve. The social sciences are also hard because certain kinds of controlled experimentation are hard. In particular, it is difficult to test hypotheses concerning the relationship of individual behaviours to macroscopic regularities. Hypotheses of the form, if individuals behave in thus and such a way, that is, follow certain specific rules, then society as a whole will exhibit some particular property. How does the heterogeneous micro-world of individual behaviours generate the global macroscopic regularities of the society? Another fundamental concern of most social scientists is that the rational actor, a perfectly informed individual with infinite computing capacity who maximises a fixed, non-evolving, exogenous utility function, bears little relation to a human being. Yet there has been no natural methodology for relaxing these assumptions about the individual. Relatedly, it is standard practice in the social sciences to suppress real-world agent heterogeneity in model building. This is done either explicitly, as in representative agent models in macroeconomics, or implicitly, as when highly aggregate models are used to represent social processes. While such models can offer powerful insights, they filter out all consequences of heterogeneity. Few social scientists would deny that these consequences can be crucially important, but there has been no natural methodology for systematically studying highly heterogeneous populations. Finally, it is fair to say that by and large, social science, especially game theory and general equilibrium theory, has been preoccupied with static equilibria and has essentially ignored time dynamics. Again, while granting the point, many social scientists would claim that there has been no natural methodology for studying non-equilibrium dynamics in social systems. We believe that the methodology developed here can help to overcome these problems. This approach departs dramatically from the traditional disciplines. First, in the way specific spheres of social behaviour, such as combat, trade, and cultural transmission, are treated, and second, in the way those spheres are combined. Artificial society models. We apply agent-based computer modelling techniques to the study of human social phenomena, including trade, migration, group formation, combat, interaction with an environment, transmission of culture, propagation of disease, and population dynamics. Our broad aim is to begin the development of a computational approach that permits the study of these diverse spheres of human activity from an evolutionary perspective as a single social science, a transdiscipline subsuming such fields as economics and demography. This modelling methodology has a long lineage, beginning with von Neumann's work on self-reproducing automata. It combines elements of many fields, including cybernetics, connectionist cognitive science, distributed artificial intelligence, cellular automata, genetic programming, genetic algorithms, artificial life, and individual-based modelling in biology. However, there have been very few attempts to bring these literatures to bear on social science. The first concerted attempts to apply, in effect, agent-based computer modelling to social science explicitly are Thomas Schelling's. In a classic series of papers, Models of Segregation in 1969, on the ecology of micromotives in 1971, and Dynamic Models of Segregation, also 1971, and later in the book Micromotives and Macro Behaviour in 1978, Schelling anticipated many of the themes encountered in the contemporary literature on agent-based modelling, social complexity, and economic evolution. Among other things, Schelling devised a simple, spatially distributed model of the composition of neighbourhoods, in which agents prefer that at least some fraction of their neighbours be of their own, quote, colour. He found that even quite colour-blind preferences produced quite segregated neighbourhoods. But Schelling's efforts were constrained by the limited computational power available at that time. It is only in the last decade that advances in computing have made large-scale agent-based modelling practical. Recent efforts in the social sciences to take advantage of this new capability include the work of quite a large list. Additionally, computer scientists interested in questions of distributed artificial intelligence, or DAI, decentralized decision-making, and game theory have been actively researching multi-agent systems. Important work here includes that of Huberman and co-workers. Biologists have even built models in which a population of agents representing humans exploits ecological resources. In what follows, we shall refer to agent-based models of social processes as artificial societies. In this approach, fundamental social structures and group behaviours emerge from the interaction of individuals operating in artificial environments under rules that place only bounded demands on each agent's information and computational capacity. We view artificial societies as laboratories, where we attempt to grow certain social structures in the computer, or in silico, the aim being to discover fundamental local or micro mechanisms that are sufficient to generate the macroscopic social structures and collective behaviours of interest. In general, such computer experiments involve three basic ingredients: agents, an environment or space, and rules. A brief word on these may be in order before discussing the particular artificial society presented in this book. Agents. Agents are the people of artificial societies. Each agent has internal states and behavioural rules. Some states are fixed for the agent's life, while others change through interaction with other agents or with the external environment. For example, in the model to be described below, an agent's sex, metabolic rate, and vision are fixed for life. However, individual economic preferences, wealth, cultural identity, and health can all change as agents move around and interact. These movements, interactions, change of state, all depend on rules of behaviour for the agents and the space. Environment. Life in an artificial society unfolds in an environment of some sort. This could be a landscape, for example, a topography of renewable resource that agents eat and metabolize. Such a landscape is naturally modelled as a lattice of resource-bearing sites. However, the environment, the medium over which agents interact, can be a more abstract structure, such as a communication network whose very connection geometry may change over time. The point is that the environment is a medium separate from the agents, on which the agents operate and with which they interact. Rules. Finally, there are rules of behaviour for the agents and for sites of the environment. A simple movement rule for agents might be: look around as far as you can, find the site richest in food, go there and eat the food. Such a rule couples the agents to their environment. One could think of this as an agent-environment rule. In turn, every site of the landscape could be coupled to its neighbours by cellular automata. See below, cellular automata rules. For example, the rate of resource growth at a site could be a function of the resource levels at neighbouring sites. This would be an environment rule. Finally, there are rules governing agent-agent interactions. Mating rules, combat rules, or trade rules, for example. Object-oriented implementation. Contemporary object-oriented programming, or OOP, languages are particularly natural ones for agent-based modelling. Objects are structures that hold both data and procedures. Both agents and environmental sites are naturally implemented as objects. The agent's data fields, its instance variables, represent its internal states, for example, sex, age, wealth. The agent's procedures, methods, are the agent's rules of behaviour, for example, eating, trading. This encapsulation of internal states and rules is a defining characteristic of OOP and greatly facilitates the construction of agent-based models. Social structures emerge. Typically, we release an initial population of agent objects into the simulated environment, a lattice of site objects, and watch for organisation into recognisable macroscopic social patterns. The formation of tribes or the emergence of certain stable wealth distributions would be examples. Indeed, the defining feature of an artificial society model is precisely that fundamental social structures and group behaviours emerge from the interaction of individual agents operating on artificial environments under rules that place only bounded demands on each agent's information and computational capacity. The shorthand for this is that we grow the collective structures from the bottom up. The Sugarscape model. While the bottom-up approach to social science is quite general, as discussed at greater length in our concluding chapter, the primary focus of the present work is a particular instance of the artificial society concept that has come to be known as the Sugarscape model. A brief summary of each chapter follows. Life and death on the Sugarscape. In Chapter 2, we introduce the Sugarscape, a spatial distribution or landscape of generalised resource that agents like to eat. The landscape consists of variously shaped regions, some rich in sugar, some relatively impoverished. Agents are born onto the Sugarscape with a vision, a metabolism, and other genetic attributes. In Chapter 2, their movement is governed by a simple local rule. Paraphrasing, it amounts to the instruction, look around as far as your vision permits, find the spot with the most sugar, go there and eat the sugar. Every time an agent moves, it burns some sugar, an amount equal to its metabolic rate. Agents die if and when they burn up all their sugar. A remarkable range of phenomena emerges from the interaction of these simple agents. The ecological principle of carrying capacity, that a given environment can support only some finite population, quickly becomes evident. When seasons are introduced, migration is observed. Migrators can be interpreted as environmental refugees, whose immigration boosts population density in the receiving zone, intensifying the competition for resources there, a dynamic with national security implications. Since agents are accumulating sugar at all times, there is always a distribution of wealth, measured in sugar, in the agent society. Does the wealth distribution mimic anything observed in human societies? Under a great variety of conditions, the distribution of wealth on the sugarscape is highly skewed, with most agents having little wealth. Highly skewed distributions of income and wealth are also characteristic of actual human societies, a fact first described quantitatively by the 19th century mathematical economist Vilfredo Pareto. Thus, we find the first instance of a qualitative similarity between extant human societies and artificial society on the sugarscape. A computerarium. As a practical matter, if such highly skewed wealth distributions are immutable laws of nature, as some have claimed, then there is little hope of greater economic equity in society. A tool like Sugarscape can function as a kind of laboratory, a computerarium, where we alter agent behavioural rules, such as those governing trade or inheritance, in order to see how immutable this kind of distribution really is. Agent social networks. Humans can be connected socially in various ways, genealogically, culturally, and economically, for example. Indeed, one of the things that makes humans complicated, conflicted, and interesting is that they can belong to many different communities or social networks at once. These networks change over time, and most interestingly, group loyalties can come into profound conflict, as when brothers, members of a family group, fought each other as members of competing political groups in the American Civil War. One theme that runs through this entire book is social connection. In each chapter, the local rules governing agent behaviour permit us to define certain kinds of agent social networks. We represent such networks as graphs and track their evolution over time and space. In particular, Chapter 2 explores social networks of neighbours. Up to this point, collective phenomena have emerged from interactions within a single population of agents. In Chapter 3, we grow distinct populations, cultural formations of agents. Sex, culture, and conflict, the emergence of history. Indeed, the aim of Chapter 3 is to grow an entire history of an artificial civilization, a proto-history, as we call it. The storyline is as follows. In the beginning, a small population of agents is randomly scattered about a landscape. Purposeful individual behaviour leads the most capable or lucky agents to the most fertile zones of the landscape. These migrations produce spatially segregated agent pools. Though less fortunate agents die on the wayside, for the survivors, life is good. Food is plentiful, Most live to ripe old ages, populations expand through sexual reproduction, and the transmission of cultural attributes eventually produces spatially distinct tribes. But their splendid isolation proves unsustainable. Populations grow beyond what local resources can support, forcing tribes to expand into previously uninhabited areas. There, the tribes collide and interact perpetually, with penetrations, combat, and cultural assimilation producing complex social histories, with violent phases, peaceful epochs, and so on. This, then, is the story we wish to grow from the bottom up. We will need a number of behavioural ingredients, each of which generates insights of its own. The first ingredient of the proto-history is sexual reproduction. Like other rules that agents execute in the model, the sex code is completely local and very simple. Yet a rich variety of demographic trajectories is observed. For instance, populations and population densities on the sugarscape can fluctuate dramatically. Because mating is local, reproduction can cease and the population can crash if the population becomes too sparse or thin. Bottom-up models such as sugarscape suggest that certain cataclysmic events, like extinctions, can be brought on endogenously without external shocks, like meteor impacts, through local interactions alone. Scientists have long been fascinated by the oscillations, intermittencies and punctuated equilibria that are observed in real plant and animal populations. They have modelled these phenomena using top-down techniques of nonlinear dynamical systems, in which aggregate state variables are related through, say, differential equations. Yet we demonstrate that all these dynamics can be grown from the bottom up. And when they are conjoined with the processes of combat, cultural exchange and disease transmission, a vast panoply of possible histories, including our proto-history, is realised on the sugarscape. It is possible to observe evolutionary processes as they alter the genetic composition of our artificial society. For example, we expect that over many generations, selection pressures will operate in favour of agents having relatively low metabolism and high vision. In fact, precisely this behaviour emerges on the sugarscape. In Chapter 3, we assign a colour to each agent according to its metabolism, then watch society change colour as selection pressures weed out high metabolism individuals over time. Selection also operates on agent vision. There is a kind of genetic algorithm, or GA, at work here, though we have not specified any fitness function beforehand. The topic of fitness and the need to define it in coevolutionary terms is addressed. With a sexual reproduction rule in place, it is natural to study genealogy using social networks. It is very interesting to watch these family trees branch out across the sugarscape. The next ingredient of the proto-history is tribe formation. How do tribes form? How does social speciation occur? To address these questions, we give agents cultural attributes and rules for their local transmission. Cultural formations then grow from the bottom up. We represent cultural connections as lines between agents who have similar cultural attributes. These cultural connection networks expand, contract, and deform over time. Finally, when agents of one cultural tribe encounter agents of a different tribe, they may engage in a primitive kind of combat. That is, agents of opposite tribes may plunder one another for sugar. However, they are not so stupid as to attack agents who are capable of defeating them, or to attack an agent of a different tribe when there are others from that tribe in the vicinity who can retaliate successfully. Thus, the combat rule results in agent movement patterns very different from the standard eat all you can find rule. We experiment with a variety of combat rules in Chapter 3. Sugar and spice. Trade comes to the sugarscape. In Chapter 4, a second commodity, spice, is added to the resource landscape, and each agent is given a corresponding metabolism for spice. The relative size of an agent's sugar and spice metabolisms determines its preferences for the two resources. The agents move around the landscape, searching for those sites that best satisfy their preferences. Each agent must at all times possess positive quantities of both sugar and spice, or it dies. Agents are then given the ability to trade sugar and spice. All trade is conducted in a decentralized fashion between neighboring agents, so-called bilateral exchange. Each pair of agents engage in trade bargains to a local price and then exchanges goods only if it makes both agents better off. The main topics investigated in the chapter concern the relationships of local prices to the formation of a single market clearing price and the welfare properties of these artificial markets. These issues are investigated for two distinct classes of agents: the idealized economic agents found in economics textbooks and agents that are non-neoclassical insofar as they have finite lives and evolving preferences. Markets of neoclassical agents. A crucial question is the following: under what conditions, for example rules of agent behaviour, will local prices converge to a market clearing general equilibrium price? We find that an equilibrium price is approached when our artificial society consists of a large number of infinitely lived agents having fixed preferences who trade for a long time. However, the resource allocations that obtain, although locally optimal, fail to be globally optimal. That is, there are additional gains from trade that our agents are unable to extract. The reason is that while bilateral exchange is pushing the artificial economy toward a globally optimal configuration, production activities, resource gathering, are constantly modifying this configuration. These two competing processes, exchange and production, yield an economy that is perpetually out of equilibrium. Because trade can simply be turned on or off in models of this type, we can study the effects of trade on other social variables. In particular, we find that the carrying capacity of the environment is increased when agents trade. However, this salutary result does not come free, for under some circumstances, trade increases societal inequality. There are further implications for the welfare properties of markets. The equilibrium price that emerges under bilateral trade has a different character than the general equilibrium price of neoclassical theory. It is statistical in nature. One implication of statistical equilibrium is that agents having identical preferences and endowments can end up in very different welfare states through decentralized trade. They encounter different people, bargain to different prices, and trade different quantities, producing initially small differences in their respective welfare states, which may be amplified with time. This phenomenon is termed horizontal inequality. Markets of non-neoclassical agents. In neoclassical economic theory, individual economic agents live forever and have fixed preferences. We give agents finite lives and the ability to reproduce sexually and study the effects on economic behaviour. The primary result of adding new agents to our artificial economy is to add variance to the distribution of trade prices in the sugar spice market. This occurs because as new agents are born, it takes time to have their internal valuations brought into line with those prevailing in the marketplace. The amount of price dispersion this effect produces increases as average agent lifetime decreases. Generally, increased variance in price corresponds to increased horizontal inequality, so the welfare properties of markets are further eroded by finite agent lives. Preferences are permitted to evolve by coupling them to the cultural exchange processes introduced in Chapter 3. This yields several interesting economic phenomena. Agents whose preferences change from one period to the next find that their accumulated holdings, quite satisfactory in the previous period, may not satisfy their current wants, so they are more willing to trade than when preferences are fixed. Overall, we find that total trade volumes are larger with evolving preferences. 2. There is much more variation in prices under such circumstances, and the average price follows a kind of random drift process. Nothing like the equilibrium of neoclassical theory emerges. Of course, the laissez-faire argument is precisely that markets left to their own devices allocate goods and services efficiently. The theoretical case for this is the so-called first theorem of welfare economics. However, when markets fail to arrive at equilibrium, the first welfare theorem does not apply, and this case for laissez-faire is undermined. Credit networks. When agents are permitted to enter into credit relationships with one another, very elaborate borrower-lender networks result. Agents borrow for purposes of having children. If an agent is of childbearing age but has insufficient wealth to produce offspring, then it will ask each of its neighbours in turn if they are willing to loan it the sugar it needs to become fertile. Prospective lenders assess the borrower's ability to repay a loan based on the borrower's past income. Once a loan has been consummated, it is repaid when due unless the borrower has insufficient accumulation, in which case it is renegotiated. The credit connections that result from these rules are very dynamic. In order to study these relationships, graphs of creditor-debtor arrangements are shown in which each agent is a vertex and edges are drawn between borrowers and lenders. These graphs are updated each time period, thus showing the evolution of credit structures spatially. Unexpectedly, some agents turn out to be borrowers and lenders simultaneously, and this is most effectively displayed as a hierarchical graph, with agents who are only lenders placed at the top of the hierarchy and those who are only borrowers positioned at the bottom. Social computation. Yet another kind of social network is a trade partner graph, in which each vertex represents an agent and edges are drawn between agents who have traded with each other during a particular time period. Such graphs not only represent social relations, but also depict the physical flow of commodities. Sugar flows one way along an edge, while spice gets transferred in the opposite direction. These graphs, webs of economic intercourse, link agents who may be spatially quite distant, even though all trade is local, that is, between neighbours. These networks are ever-changing with time and are displayed in Chapter 4 as animations. During trade, each agent acts to improve its welfare. That is, each participant optimises its own utility function. A main question addressed in Chapter 4 is, to what extent does individual local optimality result in overall social global optimality? Consider each agent to be an autonomous processing node in a computer, the agent society. Individual agents, nodes, compute only what is best for themselves not for the society of agents as a whole. Over time, the trade partner network describes the evolution of connections between these computational nodes. Thus, there is a sense in which agent society acts as a massive parallel computer, its interconnections evolving through time. This idea is fleshed out in Chapter 4. Another important area where agent-based techniques apply very naturally is that of public health, epidemiology and immunology. We study this in Chapter 5. Disease agents. Humans and infectious parasites have been co-evolving for a long time. Certainly, it would be hard to overstate the impact of infectious diseases on human society. William McNeill in 1976 has argued that infectious diseases played crucial roles in the spread of religions, political dominions, and social practices ranging from prohibitions on the consumption of pork to caste systems of the sort seen even today in India. In our own time, HIV has obviously had important socio-political impacts across a wide variety of groups on many continents. In light of all this, there is every reason to include epidemiology in social science, but there is equal reason to include social science in epidemiology. After all, the Black Death could not have spread from China to Europe without human technological advances and commercial intercourse, notably in navigation and shipping. Needless to say, military conquest and migration have been equally efficient vehicles for the dissemination of infectious disease agents. One aim of Chapter 5, then, is to break down an artificial division between fields, presenting an adaptive agents model in which the spread of infectious diseases interacts with other social processes. We also hope to advance epidemiology proper in several respects. First, our treatment of space differs fundamentally from that found in typical mathematical models. Also, mathematical epidemiology typically divides society into homogeneous subpopulations, compartments such as susceptibles and infectives, within which there is no variation among individuals. In actuality, substantial variation exists. Agents are heterogeneous precisely in that they have different immune systems. We endow every agent with its own adaptive immune system. Our immunology is, of course, very simple and highly idealized. Nonetheless, the explicit incorporation of an immune model into the epidemic model enshrines and unifies the resulting picture. Important phenomena, including immunological memory and the persistence of childhood diseases, emerge very naturally. Moreover, since infected agents suffer a metabolic increase in our model, their epidemic dynamics affect, through the agent's metabolism-dependent utility functions, their movement and economic behaviour. A society is born. Over the course of these chapters, the agent's behavioural repertoire grows to include movement, resource gathering, sexual reproduction, combat, cultural transmission, trade, inheritance, credit, pollution, immune learning, and disease propagation. In Chapter 6, we turn on all these dimensions and explore the complex, multidimensional artificial society that emerges. The book then concludes with a discussion of variations on and extensions of the current sugarscape model. Artificial societies versus traditional models. Differences between our approach and certain other methodologies, for example game theory, have already been noted. But additional ways in which artificial societies differ from traditional mathematical models and work in the field of artificial life, or A-life, also merit review. Heterogeneous agent populations. In a traditional ordinary differential equation model of an epidemic, the total population is divided into subpopulations of, say, susceptibles and infectives. These subgroups are homogeneous. Nothing distinguishes one member from another. Similarly, in ecosystem models, there are predators and prey, but homogeneity is assumed within each species. In macroeconomics, the use of representative agents assumes away real-world heterogeneity. By contrast, in agent-based models, there is no such aggregation. The spatially distributed population is heterogeneous and consists of distinct agents, each with its own genetically and culturally transmitted traits, attributes, and rules of behaviour. Individual traits can change, adapt, in the course of each agent's life as a result of interaction with other agents, with diseases, and with an environment. And in evolutionary time, which can elapse quickly on computers, selection pressures operate to alter the distribution of traits in populations. Space distinct from the agent population. In ordinary differential equation models, there is no spatial component at all. Susceptibles and infectives, predators and prey, interact in time, but not in space. In partial differential equation models, there is a physical space X, but the state variables representing agent populations, such as the infection level, are continuous in X. By contrast, in Sugarscape, the agents live on a two-dimensional lattice, but are completely distinct from it. When diseases occur, they are passed from agent to agent, but the environment and the agent's rules of interaction with it affects the spatial distribution of agents and hence the epidemic dynamics. Likewise, it affects the dynamics of trade, of combat, of population growth, of cultural transmission, and so on. Agent-environment and agent-agent interactions according to simple local rules. In the simplest form of our model, agents are born with various genetic attributes, one of which is vision, and their rule of behaviour is to look for the best unoccupied resource location. Their search is local. No agent has global information. Similarly, when we introduce trade, there is no computation by any agent or any superagent, such as the Walrasian auctioneer, of a market clearing price. Price formation takes place by a process of completely decentralised bilateral trade between neighbours. Under some conditions, prices converge to a statistical equilibrium. This artificial economy stands in stark contrast to the neoclassical general equilibrium formalism, which relies on aggregate excess demand functions or some other form of global information for the existence of and convergence to equilibrium. Focus on dynamics. One need not confine one's attention to equilibria, as is done in much of mathematical social science. A social system's rest points, its equilibria, may be the most analytical tractable configurations, but it is by no means clear that they are either the most important or interesting configurations. Indeed, in much of what follows, it will be the dynamic properties of the model rather than the static equilibria that are of most interest. In Chapter 3, for instance, we study the dynamics of cultural transmission. Over thousands of time periods, we see the sudden appearance of cultural fads and their irregular spatial propagation. These out-of-equilibrium dynamics seem far more interesting than the static cultural equilibrium into which the system is finally absorbed. With artificial societies built from the bottom up, the transients are no more difficult to study than the equilibria. Beyond methodological individualism. Our point of departure in agent-based modelling is the individual. We give agents rules of behaviour and then spin the system forward in time and see what macroscopic social structures emerge. This approach contrasts sharply with the highly aggregate perspective of macroeconomics, sociology, and certain subfields of political science, in which social aggregates like classes and states are posited ab initio. To that extent, our work can be accurately characterised as methodologically individualist. However, we part company with certain members of the individualist camp insofar as we believe that the collective structures or institutions that emerge can have feedback effects in the agent population, altering the behaviour of individuals. Agent-based modelling allows us to study the interactions between individuals and institutions. Collective structures emerge from the bottom up. A general equilibrium price, when obtained in our model, is an example of an emergent entity. In the usual general equilibrium story, it is assumed that every agent takes a price issued from the top down by the so-called Walrasian auctioneer. By contrast, we grow an equilibrium price from the bottom up through local interactions alone, dispensing with the artifice of the auctioneer and the entire aggregate excess demand apparatus. Many other collective structures emerge in our artificial society: tribes of agents, stationary wealth distributions, and collective patterns of movement, for example. Artificial societies versus a life. The Sugarscape synthesises two threads from the A-Life research tapestry. One is the field of cellular automata, or CA. A CA consists of a lattice of cells, or sites. At every time, each cell has a value, such as 0 or 1, black or white, on or off, or a colour selected from a set of colours, such as red, blue, green. These values are updated iteratively according to a fixed rule that specifies exactly how the new value of every site is computed from its own present value and the values of its immediate neighbours. Although, properly speaking, the pedigree of CAs extends at least as far back as von Neumann's work on self-replicating automata, the most familiar example is John Conway's game Life. Cellular automata have been created as models of fluid flow, earthquakes, clouds, forest fires, biological systems, and a vast array of other complex spatial processes. The Sugarscape proper, as opposed to the agents, is modelled as a CA. Another major line of work in the A-Life field does not involve an explicit space, but rather concerns the interaction of agents in a soup, a spaceless environment in which each agent may interact directly with every other agent. The agents, unlike the cells in life, have many different attributes, for example, internal states and rules of behaviour, which change through social interaction. Sugarscape agents are very simple by design. In particular, we specify the agent's behavioural rules and watch for the emergence of important macro-social structures, such as skewed wealth distributions. The agent's rules do vary, but only parametrically, not structurally. For instance, every agent has a utility function. Culturally varying parameters enter into these utility functions, but the algebraic form of the utility function remains fixed, as does the agent's practice of maximising the function. We say then that the micro rules governing economic behaviour adapt parametrically, not structurally. Similarly, agent immune systems adapt parametrically to new disease strains. The game in this particular research has been to design the simplest possible agents and explore what happens when they interact. As we shall see, the analytical challenges are already formidable. However, this is not the only possible game. Instead of giving all agents the same rule, one might begin with a population of agents, each with a different rule, and allow selection pressure to change the rule distribution over time. In other words, no individual agent adapts, but, as in evolutionary game theory, those who prosper replicate and those doing poorly eventually die out. Over time, the rule distribution evolves. Society learns, though individuals do not. Another modelling avenue is essentially to move the evolutionary process inside the agent. Here, each individual entertains a number of behavioural rules. Successful rules are promoted, while failures are demoted, so that evolutionary learning occurs within the agent. Yet more complex are models in which agents in effect invent entirely novel behavioural rules. Classifier systems and neural networks have been used in such models. Cellular automata plus agents equals sugarscape. In any event, if the pure CA is a space with no agents living on it, and the pure adaptive agents model represent agent kinetics with no underlying space, then the sugarscape model is a synthesis of these two research threads. There is an underlying space, a sugarscape, that is, a CA. But populations of agents live on the CA. The agents interact with one another and they interact with the environment. Interagent dynamics affect environmental dynamics, which feed back into the agent dynamics, and so on. The agent society and its spatial environment are coupled. Toward generative social science, can you grow it? The broad aim of this research is to begin the development of a more unified social science, one that embeds evolutionary processes in a computational environment that simulates demographics, the transmission of culture, conflict, economics, disease, the emergence of groups, and agent co-adaptation with an environment, all from the bottom up. Artificial society-type models may change the way we think about explanation in the social sciences. What constitutes an explanation of an observed social phenomenon? Perhaps one day people will interpret the question, "Can you explain it?" as asking, "Can you grow it?" Artificial society modelling allows us to grow social structures in silico, demonstrating that certain sets of micro-specifications are sufficient to generate the macro phenomena of interest. And that, after all, is a central aim. As social scientists, we are presented with already emerged collective phenomena, and we seek micro-rules that can generate them. We can, of course, use statistics to test the match between the true observed structures and the ones we grow, but the ability to grow them, greatly facilitated by modern object-oriented programming, is what is new. Indeed, it holds out the prospect of a new, generative kind of social science.